There's something different about the dark when it's untouched by electricity. Not the kind of darkness we have now, where porch lights hum quietly and a street lamp flickers down the road, but the kind that once swallowed entire towns after sunset. The kind of night where your only defense was a candle, a fire, or perhaps a Bible clutched tightly under your pillow. Early America was a place of great ambition, yes, but also of isolation. Long before highways and neon signs, settlers lived in modest homes, built of hand-cut timber. Scattered miles apart, forests didn't just line the horizon. They pressed in from all sides, thick and mysterious. Coyotes howled, trees creaked, and the silence between sounds was often louder than the noises themselves. In that silence, stories grew. They grew in the flicker of the hearth, passed between trembling hands, and whispered across creaking floorboards. They took shape in the lull between chores, or on stormy nights when lightning painted the sky and everyone gathered close. These stories of ghosts, specters, and things that could not be named were more than entertainment. For early Americans, they were explanations, warnings, and sometimes confessions. The frontier was raw. The line between life and death, seen and unseen, felt porous. A child could fall ill at noon and be buried before nightfall. A husband could leave to hunt and vanish into the woods, his name later spoken only in uneasy tones. When the facts failed to explain a disappearance, or the wind sounded too much like a whisper, people reached for the oldest comfort they had, a story. Ghost stories in early America weren't always terrifying in the way modern horror aims to be. They weren't full of jump scares or blood. Instead, they were slow, creeping, sad, even. The ghost wasn't always a monster. It might be a weeping mother, or a wronged man, or a child who never made it home. These tales lingered, not because of screams, but because of silence. Because they echoed the real emotions people carried with them through life on the edge of civilization. Grief, guilt, yearning, and fear of the unknown. Tonight, we'll slip quietly into that forgotten world. We'll explore some of the most quietly unsettling ghost stories that early Americans told and believed. We'll walk the cold floors of colonial homes where witches were once hanged. We'll hear the distant sound of footsteps behind us on frontier trails. And we'll stand, lantern in hand, outside plantation homes, where sorrow still drips from the windows like moss. We won't race through these stories. We'll take our time. We'll sit beside the storytellers as they once were, tired, cautious, and cradling a fragile sense of safety as the dark pressed in around them. These are stories meant to be told slowly, in a voice just above a whisper, while the world around you falls quiet. So before we begin, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, pull the blanket a little closer. Let the noise of the day melt away. We're stepping into a time where the night was thick, the woods were close, and the veil between the living and the dead felt just a little thinner. Let's begin. The house sat alone on a narrow road, just past the last cluster of lanterns that lit the town. It wasn't grand, just 2 rooms, a brick hearth and a lean-to out back, where firewood was stacked shoulder high. It belonged to a man named Elias, a cooper by trade, who had built the house himself after marrying a woman who died in childbirth not long after. He lived there alone now, quiet, routine. Every morning, he walked the mile into town with his barrel hoops and iron tools. Every evening, he returned as the shadows lengthened, the trees along the road shifting in the fading light like tall, breathing things. The knocking started in autumn. At first, it was easy to explain. Wind, maybe, or a tree branch near the siding. But as the nights grew colder, the knocks became clearer. 3 taps, always at the same hour, just after Elias had blown out the last candle. When the hearth had settled into its last low orange glow, he would lie there in bed, blanket pulled up to his chin, and hear it. Knock, knock, knock. Soft, precise, as if knuckles pressed gently against wood just beside his head. He rose the first night, opened the door, saw nothing but fog hugging the yard and the twisted outline of the old well near the fence. He checked the back door, the windows, the lean-to. Nothing. The next night, the same. He asked a neighbor if they'd heard anything odd on their side of the woods, and the man shook his head. "There's nothing out there but deer and cold," he said. "Unless you're still carrying something." The neighbor didn't explain what he meant by carrying. By the seventh night, Elias stopped answering the door. He simply lay in bed, wide-eyed, listening. The knock came again, 3 gentle taps. Never louder, never rushed, just enough to be heard. Then one night, it stopped. He woke up, startled by the silence. It was well past midnight. The fire had gone out, no knocking. But just as he began to exhale, relieved, he heard a whisper, not outside, but inside. Near the hearth, a woman's voice, soft as breath. "Why did you leave me alone?" Elias never returned to town after that winter. His home, eventually sold by distant cousins, stood empty for years. Neighbors said they sometimes still heard knocks late at night if they passed too close to the road. The new owners tore the house down, but the well remains. Mossy, covered, undisturbed. They say if you place your hand on the wood at midnight, you can feel warmth, as if someone is waiting just beneath it. Ghost stories like this one weren't just whispered for thrills. They were believed. In early America, people trusted their senses more than books. If you heard something, saw something, or felt something strange, it meant something. There was no internet to fact-check, no psychologist to diagnose a waking dream, just your gut, your fear. And maybe a neighbor who remembered hearing something similar, once, long ago. Some said ghosts were the dead seeking justice. Others believed they were warnings from God. But all agreed on one thing. When a spirit lingered, it was because something had been left undone. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore some of the most well-known and well-feared ghost stories from the corners of early America, stories that traveled by word of mouth, by newspaper, by sermon, stories passed down not just to frighten, but to remind that the past is not always past, that silence sometimes has a shape, and that, even now, some knocks are never answered. If you walked the outskirts of Salem Village in the late 1600s, before it became a tourist map of witch hats and wooden signs, you'd find a small slope just past the meeting house. Not quite a hill, really. More of a rise in the land where the trees thin and the wind thickens. The locals call it Gallows Hill, though no official marker ever said so. Too much shame clung to the name. It's said that near the base of that rise, where the ground dips into a marshy hollow, a house once stood, long gone now, swallowed by ivy and time. But if you listen closely, some say you can still hear a woman's voice there, not screaming, just humming, a lullaby with no words, a tune that carries even when there's no wind. The story tied to that hum is one of the oldest ghost tales in Salem, older than the trials themselves. They say the house belonged to a midwife, a quiet woman who lived alone, respected but rarely welcomed. She brewed teas, tended wounds, and brought babies into the world, but never one of her own. When the hysteria swept through Salem like a fever, fingers pointed quickly. A girl had a nightmare, a pig died, a shadow crossed a window, and suddenly the midwife became a name on a list. She was hanged at Gallows Hill just after sunrise. Her final words were not recorded, but the next night, her home burned. No one saw who lit the fire. No one tried to save it. The odd thing? The next morning, only the front room had burned. The rest of the house stood untouched, as if protected by something unseen. Inside, the hearth was still warm. On the mantel, a single clay doll remained. Its face cracked, but its eyes somehow intact. That's where the humming began. The first to hear it was a woodcutter passing by in the early dawn. He paused, confused, thinking someone must have returned to the ruins. But when he approached, the house was still, the ashes cold, and the doll gone. Children whispered that the doll could walk on its own, that it showed up in strange places by the well, on doorsteps, once even inside the meeting house itself. Always silent, always watching, always watching. Adults, of course, dismissed it. Nonsense, they said. Fairy tales to keep children in bed. But the humming continued. And more than once, someone claimed to see a figure at the edge of the woods. A woman in a faded gray shift, head turned slightly, as if listening to something just behind her. She never moved, never blinked, just waited. For what? No one knew. In Puritan New England, the bed was a sacred place, not just for rest, but for reflection, repentance, and fear. Most homes had a single shared bed, passed down generations, carved by hand and creaking with age. Children often slept at the foot, curled near their parents' legs, or layered on straw mats beside it. There were no separate rooms, no soundproof walls. Every breath, cough, or whimper was heard. Every dream was shared. And sometimes, not all of those dreams came from the living. One such story came from the journal of Reverend Tobias Grafton, a minister in Essex County around 1698. Known for his strict sermons and sleepless nights, Grafton recorded between fevered prayers and Old Testament verses an experience he never dared speak from the pulpit. He wrote, "On the 5th night of October, whilst in the arms of my own bed, I heard the faint utterance of Scripture beside me. The voice was not my own. It came low, like the breath of someone reciting but with no breath behind it." His wife had passed 2 years earlier, a quiet woman named Mercy, who had died of a wasting illness. Their bed had remained untouched since. Grafton refused to replace it, saying it was consecrated by marriage and suffering. At first he assumed the whispering was a dream, but the second night it returned, reciting lines from the Psalms, specifically Psalm 88, the Psalm of Despair. "I am counted with them that go down into the pit." The voice was not Mercy's. It was younger, male, hollow. Grafton wrote that on the third night, he felt the mattress shift, as if someone had knelt beside him. He did not open his eyes. On the fourth night, he sprinkled salt at the corners of the bed and laid his Bible on the pillow beside him. On the fifth, he moved to the floor. The whispering followed. Eventually, he abandoned the room entirely, choosing instead to sleep on a wooden bench in the church vestry. The bed remained empty. Visitors who came to see the Reverend claimed to hear prayers through the wall at night. One even insisted he saw the sheets stir through the window, though the shutters were nailed shut. When Grafton died, the bed was removed from the home and buried. Yes, buried. Not sold, not burned, placed in a shallow grave behind the church, sprinkled with ash, salt, and rosemary. A crude stone marker was placed over it, reading only, "He maketh me to lie down." Locals say the earth there stays soft, even in winter. In the minds of early Americans, especially Puritans, spirits were not abstract. They weren't distant echoes. They were close, sometimes angelic, often demonic, and always real. To them, the devil walked beside the righteous, and ghosts were either divine warnings or trickery in disguise. The line between salvation and haunting was razor thin. Beds, in particular, were vulnerable places. Night was a time of temptation, of dreams and visitations. Many homes kept psalters open on nightstands, or pinned verses to the wall above the headboard. "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night," they would recite before blowing out the candle. But not everyone slept easy, especially in Salem, where the air still seemed to carry the weight of unspoken names. The story began, as most unsettling things do, without a clear beginning. It didn't start with a scream, or a death, or a fire. Just with a feeling, a quiet unease that settled into the homes of a few families in Salem Village in the early 1700s, like a draft sneaking under the door when no wind was blowing. They described it the same way, though none of them spoke to each other at first. They would be settling into the evening, folding linens, stirring a pot, stoking the fire, and suddenly feel the sensation that someone was watching, but not from within, from just outside, always at the same hour, dusk, that uncanny hour when shadows grow longer than the objects casting them, and the last gold light stretches across wooden floors like reaching hands, and always from the window. The first to report it was a widow named Hannah Cole, who lived alone at the edge of the village. She said she was preparing her supper when she noticed her cat hissing toward the window. When she looked up, she didn't see anything at first, but then she saw the faint outline of a figure. It stood motionless, just the suggestion of a body behind the wavering glass. No details, no face, just the impression of something draped, as if shrouded in a burial cloth. She stepped forward, certain it must be a neighbor, maybe someone lost or in need, but when she opened the door, no one was there. The snow around her doorstep was untouched. She shut the door quickly and lit every candle in the house. Over the next week, the figure returned. Not every night, but often enough that she began to dread the pink tint of sunset. She spoke to her minister about it, who suggested she recite Psalm 27 aloud before sleep. "Whom shall I fear?" he reminded her. She obeyed. It didn't help. Soon, other families began to whisper similar things. Stories of someone watching from outside, always wrapped in something grayish-white, never moving. Some swore the figure's face was visible, drawn, pale, but not angry, just hollow, sad. Children began calling it the Shrouded Watcher. What frightened them most was not what the ghost did, but what it didn't do. It didn't knock, it didn't speak, it didn't try to come inside. It just waited, patiently, silently. And if you looked away, even for a moment, it would vanish. One young boy reportedly threw hot cider at it from his upstairs window. His mother found him the next morning, still awake, clutching a Bible, saying it had stared through him. Eventually, the sightings stopped, just as quietly as they had begun. No explanation, no climax, just an eerie absence, a void where fear had once been. Some claimed it was the spirit of a local woman who had died during childbirth and been buried in a poorly marked grave beneath what became the church garden. Others said it was no one at all, just the devil's trick to test their faith. Years later, when a new home was built over the widow Hannah's cottage foundation, the builders reportedly found a pair of shoes buried under the threshold, child-sized, wrapped in cloth, tied with twine. They burned them, but the man who burned them never returned to finish the house. He simply left. No note, no belongings, just an open door and a single cold fire pit. They say the new owners keep their windows shuttered, always. In early American homes, windows were not just for light. They were seen as thresholds, as eyes, portals where things could peer in or pass through. It's why so many homes were built with small panes and heavy curtains, and why some placed protective charms or scripture verses folded and tucked into the corners of the frame. To them, glass was not enough to keep the spirit world out. Sometimes, it was barely enough to see it. The hearth was the heart of the early American home. It gave light, warmth, cooked meals, and dried wet boots. It was where stories were told and scriptures read. It was where grief was mourned quietly after the visitors left, and it was also, sometimes, where strange things lingered long after the body had been buried. The tale of the fire that would not die comes from the village records of Rowley, just north of Salem, dated around 1722. The home belonged to a man named Obadiah Flint, a recluse, though not unkind. He was known for two things: his habit of reading aloud to himself in the evenings, and his stubborn refusal to let anyone else tend his fire. Even on the coldest winter nights, when neighbors offered wood or help, he would only nod politely and close the door. Obadiah died in early March. A passing merchant found him slumped in his chair beside the hearth, one hand holding a book of sermons, the other limp by his side. The fire was still burning. The neighbors did what neighbors did. They prepared his body, cleaned the room, and left the hearth to go cold. Except it didn't. The next morning, when the magistrate arrived to review Obadiah's belongings, the fire had rekindled itself, small, low, but unmistakably alive. They doused it with water. The fire hissed, retreated, and returned that night. Puzzled, they checked for hidden embers or someone sneaking in to relight it, but the door remained barred, the windows shuttered, and the woodpile untouched. On the third night, the fire grew brighter, hotter. Flames licked higher than they should have, but only within the hearth, never spreading. Several townspeople gathered to watch, standing at a safe distance, unwilling to approach. Someone suggested it was Obadiah's soul, refusing to move on. Another thought, it might be a devil's trick. A woman quietly whispered that Obadiah had once lost a wife and child in a fire when he was young. Perhaps, she said, the fire had been waiting all this time to claim him fully. Eventually, a minister was summoned from Ipswich. He arrived with a Bible, a pail of holy water, and 3 young men with shovels. They dismantled the hearth brick by brick. When they removed the final stone from the firebox, they found nothing. No hidden flue, no hidden fuel. Just a clean, blackened floor, cool to the touch. The minister prayed, sprinkled the threshold, and ordered the remains of the hearth to be buried at the edge of the property. That night, the wind changed. Neighbors claimed they saw smoke rising from the buried bricks, a low plume, drifting sideways instead of up, moving like breath. No one rebuilt the house. They let it fall in on itself. Grass grew over the ruins. Eventually, trees, but hunters still speak of a place in the woods where warmth lingers unnaturally, a circle where the snow melts first, where animals never rest, and where if you press your hand to the earth, you'll swear you feel something pulsing beneath it, like a heartbeat or a flame. For early Americans, fire was more than heat. It was spirit, a symbol of life, of the soul. To them, a fire that refused to die was not just strange, it was personal. Fires were tended with prayers, lit with blessings, and extinguished with care. Letting a hearth burn unattended was seen as dangerous, not only for the home but for the spirit world. Because what if, just what if, the fire wasn't yours anymore? The final tale, whispered around the hearths of Salem Village, was one that involved no specter, no ghostly knock, no wandering figure on the road. And yet, it haunted the townsfolk longer than any shadow ever could. It happened during a particularly brutal winter, the kind that buried wagons, froze well pumps, and kept entire families sealed indoors for weeks. The snow arrived early that year and stayed with a stubborn grip, like a cold hand refusing to let go. A young boy named Thomas Green went missing one morning after stepping outside to gather kindling. He had wandered just beyond the fence line. His footprints were found in the snow. They led toward the woods and then vanished. No struggle, no signs of animal tracks, no blood, just an ending. The town searched, they prayed, they rang the bell 3 times for his soul. But by the second week, the minister declared him lost. God, he said, has taken the child into his keeping. 3 days later, the child's name appeared, written in soot on the wall above his family's hearth. Thomas. Neatly scrawled, letters black and perfect. No smudges, no drips. No broom had ever touched that spot. Ceiling was too high for a child to reach, and the soot had crusted over clean stone. But there it was. They tried to scrub it. Soot smeared and blackened the wall, but the name remained, like it was beneath the surface, etched somehow. Not just painted. The family sealed the fireplace and began sleeping upstairs. They said the air in the parlor grew strangely warm at night, even without the fire lit. And every morning, no matter how cold the house had been, the stones beneath the name were dry, as if warmed from within. Some said Thomas had simply wandered into the cold and died peacefully, his spirit returning home. Others weren't so sure. One neighbor recalled something the boy had said just before he vanished, that he'd seen a man made of smoke standing behind the trees. The family moved away in spring. The house stood empty for a few seasons before a new couple moved in. A school teacher and his wife. They whitewashed the wall, painted over it, hung tapestries and shelves. But on damp days, the soot bled through. The name returned, always the same, always centered. Thomas. Eventually, the house was torn down. The stones sold off for repairs elsewhere. A few even went into the foundation of the local meeting house. They say that, even now, On cold Sunday mornings when the wind is just right, a faint trail of soot can be seen creeping along the beams above the pulpit. It doesn't form the name anymore, but it does linger, like something waiting to be written again. For early Americans, the hearth wasn't just a place of fire, it was a place of memory. Names were spoken there, Bibles were read aloud, farewells were whispered to the dead, and sometimes, it seems, those names didn't want to be forgotten. They didn't scream, they didn't moan, they simply wrote themselves back into the story. It begins with a light, just one, small, flickering, drifting across the low cotton rows at the edge of dusk. The field is quiet, the air hangs heavy, humid, and the trees lining the property sway with the breathless rhythm of summer. Crickets murmur. A whippoorwill calls once, then goes silent, and the light moves again. Not fast, not frantic, but slow, like someone walking with a lantern, except there's no path there, and no one should be walking that way. Not at this hour. This story, one told quietly on porches and whispered through open windows, belongs to the southern plantations, specifically a worn piece of land just outside Natchez, Mississippi. The year was 1811. The plantation house, large and pale, sat atop a hill that overlooked rows of cotton and a deep bend in the river. The house was new. The land was not. They called the place Cypress Hollow. And like most plantations of the time, it was built on suffering. The enslaved workers on the property told of a particular light that began to appear not long after a young woman named Eliza died in childbirth in one of the slave cabins. Eliza had been barely 17. She was known to hum when she worked and had once braided corn husk dolls for the overseer's children. She'd gone into labor early, alone, while the others were out picking. By the time someone heard her screams, it was too late. They buried her quietly, as was custom. A small grave with no marker, only a bundle of dogwood branches tied together with twine. And then, the light began. At first, it was seen just once, by a young boy walking back from the smokehouse after dusk. He said he saw a lantern bobbing out by the edge of the field, drifting just above the ground, but no one believed him. The fields were dark, and his eyes were young. Then someone else saw it, and then another. Always at the same time. Twilight, always near the place where Eliza had died. Some claimed it was her spirit, still searching for her baby. Others said it was a warning light, meant to keep people from forgetting what had happened there. But the most unsettling part, the light moved with intention. It didn't flicker in the wind like a candle. It didn't bounce like a torch. It glided, as if held by someone moving just beneath the surface of the world. It passed through bushes. It dipped low into the cotton. White paused near the grave, and then disappeared. One night, an overseer, angered by the whispers and laughter about ghost lights, marched into the field with a torch and a pistol. He stood there, shouting into the dark. The workers watched from the cabins, saying nothing. The next morning, he was found asleep in the middle of the field. His pistol was gone. His torch lay unburned beside him, and his boots, muddy when he left, were spotless. He never spoke of it again. Ghost lights were not uncommon in early Southern folklore. They were called will-o'-the-wisps, plantation lanterns, or simply the wandering glow. Sometimes they marked tragedy, sometimes guilt, sometimes unfinished stories. Among the enslaved, these lights were never just superstition. They were warnings, messages passed down through spirit and flame. The light at Cypress Hollow continued for years, even after Eliza's name faded, even after the fields were plowed under and the house fell to ruin. Travelers on the river still say that sometimes, in the early blue of morning, they see a glow among the trees. Not bright, just enough to follow. Few ghost stories from early America ever grew so large they spilled beyond whispers and into court records, journals, and sermons. But the Bell Witch did. To this day, no one agrees on what exactly the Bell Witch was. A spirit? A curse? A demon? Or just a very persistent echo of something ancient and wrong? The story begins in Adams, Tennessee, in the early 1800s, on a modest stretch of farmland owned by a man named John Bell. His family lived in a simple home. Wooden walls, one large hearth, and beds separated by curtains rather than doors. They were not rich. They were not particularly remarkable until the knocking began. It started on the walls at night, just soft tapping, like someone drumming a finger against the boards. Then came the scratching, then the whispers. At first, unintelligible, then clearer, voices that spoke names and secrets. The children were terrified. The Bell daughter, Betsy, began to feel her hair pulled as she lay in bed. She told her father the spirit had slapped her one night, hard across the face. He didn't believe her until he saw the red mark the next morning. Visitors reported hearing the voice too. Sometimes it spoke in rhyme. Sometimes it cursed in languages no one recognized. Sometimes it sang, and sometimes it mimicked. Voices of people it had overheard, sermons it had heard once and recited perfectly. It would interrupt prayers, mock conversations, laugh at the wrong moments. The spirit claimed to be many things. Once, it said it was the ghost of a native woman wronged by white settlers. Another time, it claimed to be a murdered traveler. Yet another night it said, simply and coldly, "I am nothing you can name." The haunting grew violent. John Bell himself became the target. He developed a strange affliction. His tongue swelled, his limbs trembled, and his speech faltered. The spirit taunted him during his fits, hissing threats and calling him Old Jack. When he died in 1820, the voice allegedly laughed during his funeral. Witnesses said they heard it say, "I fixed him." What makes this story stand out is that dozens of people recorded their experiences. Neighbors, preachers, travelers. Even General Andrew Jackson, who visited the Bell farm, reportedly left after one night, declaring, "I would rather face the entire British Army than spend another evening with that witch." To this day, the land is quiet, too quiet. The Bell family home is gone, but a small cave nearby remains. Known simply as the Bell Witch Cave, it draws visitors and thrill seekers. Locals say that sometimes, when the air is still and the cave mouth is just beginning to breathe, you can hear a whisper from deep within. Not angry, not loud, but amused, waiting. For many early Americans, spirits were not abstract. They had intentions, personalities, sometimes even agendas. The Bell Witch terrified not because it was unknown, but because it knew too much. It turned a simple farmhouse into a theater of fear, with a voice that couldn't be explained and didn't need to be. Because the fear had already taken root, the house was quiet. Too quiet, they said. It stood on the outskirts of St. Francisville, Louisiana. A white wooden structure with tall shutters and a wide porch wrapped like a ribbon around the front. From the outside, it looked like any other plantation house of the era. Elegant, orderly, serene. But inside, the silence had an edge to it. It wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like the house was listening. The family who lived there in the 1830s, the Marlows, were plantation owners of moderate wealth. They had inherited the property from an uncle who had passed without children, and they moved in with optimism. New paint, new furniture, new curtains that fluttered in the breeze. And then, on their third night, they heard it, a cry, faint but clear, coming from beneath the floorboards of the front parlor. It wasn't a shout, it wasn't words, just a slow, breathy weeping, the kind of sound someone makes when they've been crying for hours, not minutes, ragged, soft, resigned. At first, they assumed it was the wind. Louisiana nights were full of strange noises, the shifting of swamp water, the hoot of owls, the rustle of palmettos, but the sound returned the next night, and the one after that, always after dark, always from the same spot. Mr. Marlowe pried up the boards, expecting to find an animal. Nothing. Just dry earth, roots, and a few curled leaves, blown in through old cracks. He replaced the boards. The crying returned. They moved the rug, placed furniture over the spot, sprinkled ashes, salt, even placed a cross beneath the hearth. Nothing worked. And then, one evening, the voice changed. Instead of crying, they heard a single word, repeated, over and over. so softly they couldn't be sure they'd heard it right. "Mama." Marlowe began sleeping upstairs. But they are. The children refused to go near the parlor. Servants lit candles, even during daylight hours, and refused to step barefoot near that part of the house. An old woman who had once worked on the property told them, finally, what she remembered. Years earlier, long before the house had passed to the Marlowes, a young enslaved girl had given birth in secret. Her child had been taken from her in the night. She'd screamed and clawed at the floorboards until her fingers bled, begging to hold the baby one last time. The child had died days later from illness. The mother, they said, never spoke again. She passed within the month. They had buried her near the trees out back, unmarked, unblessed. The Marlowes had the house blessed twice. They offered to rebuild the parlor entirely. Nothing helped. Eventually, the crying faded, not because of prayer or repairs, but because the house was abandoned. And years later, when travelers stayed the night on the overgrown property, they still told the same story, that as the crickets fell quiet and the last candle flickered, they heard it, a weeping sound, coming not from outside, not from the wind, but from the floor beneath them. And if they pressed their ear to the boards, they sometimes heard something else, a heartbeat, too small, too soft, too steady, to be imagined. In the American South, so many stories were never written down, so many voices were silenced. But sorrow has a strange way of surviving. It seeps into walls, lingers in air, folds itself into song and silence. The cry beneath the floorboards is not just a ghost story. It is a memory made of pain, etched into the wood grain, repeating itself for those willing to listen. Long after the fires had gone cold, long after the last voice of the day had been spoken, and long after the crows had settled on their roosts, there were still sounds that did not belong to the living. In the fields outside Augusta, Georgia, there's a stretch of earth that locals call Hush Hollow. The name is whispered more than spoken, and not found on any map. Those who live nearby know better than to ask why it's called that. But the ones who remember, the old storytellers, the night watchers, the people whose great-grandparents worked that land, they'll tell you plainly, it's because the chains still rattle there. The legend begins on a plantation that once sat on that very soil, built on red clay and suffering. In the 1830s, it was owned by a man known only as Colonel B. No first name ever recorded, only that he kept 2 hounds, a double-barreled shotgun, and a row of iron manacles nailed to the wall of his barn. He was known for his cruelty, not just punishment, but performance. He believed that fear kept people obedient, and his favorite method was public shackling. When an enslaved person tried to escape, he didn't whip them. He chained them to trees, to posts, sometimes even to the edge of the field, where others were forced to work within view. It is said that one autumn, a group of 5 escaped under cover of night. They crossed the river, using a fallen tree as a bridge. For 3 days they ran, but on the 4th, the dogs found them. Only one returned alive. The rest were never seen again. No funerals, no burials, just silence. And then the sounds began. The workers heard it first, late at night, when the wind was still and the cicadas had gone quiet. A soft dragging, a clink, then another, as if someone were moving slowly across the fields, weighed down by something heavy. Clink, drag, pause. It circled the cabins, always staying just out of sight. One man claimed he saw shadows in the corn rows, tall and silent, moving against the wind. Another said he found prints in the mud that led to the river and simply stopped. The colonel scoffed at it, called it foolishness. But one morning, he woke to find his barn doors wide open. Inside, the manacles lay in a pile, the nails pulled out, bent backward, as if someone had torn them free from the inside. He tried to move them, Senate, but isn't, burn them, toss them into the river. But every night after that, the sound of chains returned. Some said they were reminders. Others said they were warnings. The workers refused to go into the fields after sundown. They planted in silence. They harvested in silence. They prayed with their backs to the rows. The colonel died alone. A heart attack, they said, though no one could explain the bruises around his ankles, as if something had held him tightly before he fell. Years passed. The land was sold, the fields reclaimed by thickets and moss. But the sounds remained. Even today, hunters speak of that place, of a certain patch where their dogs whimper, refuse to step, of sounds at night, metal on metal, dragging in rhythm. And if you sit long enough, they say, you can hear the breathing, slow, labored, close, and then nothing, only hush. In many southern ghost stories, chains are not metaphor, they are memory. These are stories born of trauma, passed in whispers to protect the living and honor the lost. The rattling chains are not threats, they are reminders that pain leaves traces, that cruelty echoes, and that some stories refuse to sleep quietly. There is a tree in the south that doesn't bloom anymore, not because it died, but because it remembers. They call it the mourning tree, an old live oak standing alone on a low hill near the banks of the Yazoo River in Mississippi. Its branches sprawl wide like arms reaching to embrace something long gone. Its bark is gnarled, textured with time, and if you walk beneath it on a summer afternoon, you'll notice something strange. It's always cooler there, not breezy, not shaded, cool, like the sun has agreed to stop shining just for that patch of earth. The first known story, tied to the mourning tree, goes back to the 1820s. A woman in black began appearing beneath its limbs, not walking, not arriving, just standing, always at dusk, always facing east. She never moved, never lifted her head, and never spoke. She wore a long black veil, the kind usually reserved for funerals, and a shawl knotted tightly at the chest. Children who spotted her said she held something small in her arms, wrapped in white, barely visible, a bundle, a baby maybe, or perhaps a memory too fragile to name. No one ever approached her. The moment anyone tried, she would vanish, not run, not fade, just gone, like breath into fog. And yet she returned, night after night. People began tying scraps of fabric to the tree's lower limbs, strips of cotton, bits of lace, even pieces of prayer cloth, not as decoration, but as offerings. They believed the woman was mourning something she couldn't lay to rest. And perhaps, if she saw their prayers hanging there, she might find peace. But she never left. Even as generations passed and the plantations fell to ruin, the woman remained, always at dusk, always in black, always holding something the world had taken from her. One story, passed down through old families in the region, claimed the woman had once been enslaved, her child sold off in infancy to another estate upriver. She had waited every evening beneath the tree for years, hoping to see a stranger pass who might bear a resemblance, hoping that somehow he'd come back. She died at the base of the tree, they said. Her heart gave out, but her mourning didn't. It stayed. The tree never bore flowers again, but it grew, and with each year, more scraps were added. Bright ribbons, threads of blue, and red, and yellow, little crosses tied from twine, notes scribbled in charcoal, tokens of grief, of thanks, of hope. And still the figure came. Travelers passing through have reported seeing her as recently as the 1940s. One even said he saw her lift the bundle in her arms and press her face to it, though the veil never moved. Others say she's not just mourning a child, but mourning us all, that she weeps for the brokenness in the world and the burdens that never find rest, that we've all stood beneath that tree in some way, even if we didn't know it, and that she stands still because we haven't learned how to stop running. In the Old South, the line between the sacred and the haunted was thin. Trees were not just wood and leaves. They were memory, witness, altar. People believed in spirit places, locations where grief took root so deeply that it lived on long after the weeping stopped. The mourning tree is one of them, a place where pain and prayer met in the shade, a place that remembers when the world forgets. The Great Plains are not quiet. They only seem that way until you've sat in them long enough. At first you notice the wind, soft and constant, like a great invisible hand sweeping across endless grass. Then come the birds, the rustle of insects, the groan of trees swaying at the edge of the world. And then there's something else, a pause, a space between the sounds. a gap that doesn't belong to the land, or the creatures, or the air. That's where the whispers live, on the frontier, long before barbed wire and telephone poles carved the land into grids. People settled where no one had lived before, or so they thought. Cabins were raised with raw timber, their roofs packed with mud and thatch, their windows small, if there were windows at all. One such cabin stood near the pines outside of what is now Kansas. It belonged to a man named Jedediah Holt and his wife Clara. They had come west to escape crowded towns, looking for quiet and clean air and a place to start anew. What they found instead was a voice in the trees. It began in winter, the season when even the snow seemed to hold its breath. The cabin was tight, the fire steady, and the nights long. Clara was the first to hear it, just a single word, carried faintly on the wind. Wait. She asked Jedediah if he'd spoken. He hadn't. He told her it was nothing, just a tree creaking, or a breeze hitting the eaves in a certain way. But the next night, she heard it again. By the third night, they both heard it. They stepped outside with a lantern, hoping to find an owl or an echo. But the night air was still, the trees standing like soldiers under a frozen sky. When spring came, the voice didn't leave. It simply changed. Sometimes it was a whisper that followed them as they walked between the trees. Sometimes it came from inside the cabin itself, faint, urgent, and always watching. They began to argue. Jedediah wanted to leave. Clara refused. She said it was their land, and the voice didn't mean harm. She said it was lonely. That's when the dreams began. Jedediah would wake in a sweat, sure that someone had been in the room, standing by the bed, face unseen, breath visible in the cold. Clara said she saw a man outside the window one morning, his hand pressed to the glass, eyes full of grief. When they opened the door, no one was there, but a handprint remained, faint, as if made from smoke and ash. One day, Jedediah packed a satchel and saddled the mule. He didn't speak. Clara wept. She said the voice had asked her not to let him go. She said something terrible would happen. He left anyway. He was never seen again. The mule returned 5 days later, alone, saddle torn. No blood, no tracks, just silence. Clara stayed another year, then vanished too. No records, no grave, but the cabin remained, and travelers who pass that way, even now, say the trees still murmur. Sometimes it's words, sometimes it's just a feeling, but if you stop too long in that hollow, you might hear it too. Wait, the frontier was a place of isolation, of great space and small voices. Early settlers brought their faith, their fears, and their silence with them. And in the absence of sound, the mind begins to listen for something, anything. In places where the land feels older than the people walking it, whispers come easy. They are not always spirits. Sometimes they are memories that never settled properly into the earth. She was first seen at a distance, a figure in white, drifting through the tall grass just after sunrise. Neither hurried nor hesitant. Her path was always straight, as if she walked not through grass and soil, but across something unseen, a memory, a promise, or maybe a road that only she remembered. They called her the Prairie Bride, though no one knew her name. Sightings of her go back to at least the 1840s, in the wide-open flatlands between Nebraska and northern Kansas, always at dawn or dusk, always alone. A long veil floated behind her, trailing in the breeze that never seemed to touch the grass around her. Some said she wore no shoes. Others swore she hovered just an inch above the ground. But everyone agreed on this. She never looked up. She never spoke. And she never stopped walking. Wagon families traveling westward would occasionally spot her in the morning haze, far from the trail. Children would wave, but she never waved back. Fathers would pause the oxen and peer through spyglasses, thinking perhaps someone was lost or in need. But by the time they stepped down to help, she would vanish behind the folds of the land. One account came from a schoolteacher moving west with her sister. She wrote in her diary, "A woman of most ghostly aspect walked alongside our path this morning, yet not on it. She bore no bundle. Her dress was not of this season, And though we called to her, she did not flinch. Her face I could not see, and yet I felt her grief as if it had been my own. Local stories tried to explain her. Some said she had been a bride left behind, whose husband had died en route to Oregon. Others claimed she had drowned in a flooded river on her wedding day, her spirit forever seeking a church that no longer stood. A more sorrowful version spoke of a young woman who had been promised freedom, a life off the prairie, away from labor, away from shame. But when that promise was broken, she walked into the tall grass one morning and never returned. The next sunrise, she was seen again, farther away, and again the next day, and again, always walking, always toward the same horizon. Some say she walks still, that if you wake just before the light breaks fully, when the grass still holds last night's dew, and you squint toward the edge of the earth, you might see her, a white figure, silent, unchanging. And if you do, it's best to keep moving, because they say that those who follow her never come back. In the vastness of the plains, where sky meets ground with nothing in between, the imagination takes strange shapes, but the drifting woman was not imagination. She was observation. Too many had seen her. Too many stories matched. The prairie was, and still is, a place where loneliness stretches for miles. Some souls, they say, never find the edge of it. It was never supposed to be there. That's what everyone said. Riders crossing the plains, traders heading for distant forts, trappers returning with pelts strapped to their mules. Each of them claimed the same strange encounter. A small wooden cabin, seemingly abandoned, nestled in a patch of scrub where no cabin should have been. No chimney smoke, no animal sounds, just stillness. And one chilling detail. There was no door, no opening, no hinges, no gap in the frame, just four walls, a slanted roof, and a single soot-smudged window. Always too dark to see through, no matter the time of day. One of the first written accounts comes from a man named Elias Duval, a French fur trader who passed through the Oklahoma Territory in 1847. In his journal, he described waking at dawn and seeing the structure in the distance. All. It was perhaps the size of a single wagon's length, made of grayish wood, aged and dry. I thought it odd, for no structure had stood there the day before. I approached and circled it twice. There was no entrance, only a window, and a great weight in the air around it. Duval left without touching it. Others weren't so wise. A settler named Burke, traveling alone from Missouri to New Mexico, claimed he tried to break in, curious to know if someone was inside. He used a crowbar to pry at the wall. The wood split like bark, revealing something strange beneath. Not timber, not earth, but black stone, smooth, cold, and humming softly. He dropped his tool and backed away. That night, his mule fled. He followed its tracks for hours and never found them again. He returned to the site. The cabin was gone. Just a patch of dead grass and 4 indentations in the soil where the corners had stood. Another traveler, a woman named Miriam Jones, saw the cabin twice, once in Kansas, once in Colorado. Same shape, same dimensions, same absence of a door. She claimed that both times she heard music coming from inside, not played music, hummed, soft, droning, in a key she couldn't identify. It made her teeth hurt and her chest tighten. She walked away. Years later, a group of military scouts reported stumbling upon a strange structure out on the Santa Fe Trail. Their report called it an unlisted building of curious construction, devoid of entrance. They left it unmarked on their map. Some theories claimed it was a trap, a spirit house, a prison for something not meant to be released. Others believed it was a ghost of a building, something that had once existed, ripped from time and condemned to appear randomly, unfinished, unanswered. But one detail is shared in every version. The window, always that single square of glass, dim and dust-covered. I'd always, according to witnesses, a sense that someone, something, was standing just beyond it, looking out, never waving, never blinking, just waiting. On the frontier, buildings were signs of comfort, of rest, of arrival. But the cabin with no door turned that symbol on its head. It offered no welcome, no shelter, no explanation. It simply stood, silent, daring you to ask what's inside, and perhaps daring you to remember that some places are not meant to be entered. The storm came fast. They always did on the prairie, rising like ghosts from the horizon and swallowing the sky in a matter of minutes. One moment, sunlight stretched across the grass in golden ribbons, and the next, a curtain of white swept in, blinding and cold, like the land itself had forgotten the sun ever existed. In the winter of 1863, a family of 4, Jonas and Ruth Ainsley and their 2 sons, were caught in one such storm in the Dakota Territory. Their cabin was simple but strong, walls thick with packed mud and hay, a single stone fireplace at its heart. It was just enough to hold back the worst of the wind. They sealed the windows, latched the door, fed the fire, and waited. But that night, as the blizzard howled outside and the frost began to creep along the inside of the glass, they heard something that didn't belong to the storm. A voice. Not a scream, not the wind's cry twisted into some animal shape, but a voice. Human. Distinct. Right outside the door. "Ruth, open up. Please, it's me." The voice was warm, familiar. It sounded like Ruth's brother, Abraham, who had died the previous spring of fever. She froze. Tears sprang to her eyes. "Ruth, I'm cold. I just need to come in for a moment." Jonas pulled her back from the door. Their sons clung to each other by the fire, eyes wide. There was no knock, just the voice. Calm, patient. Jonas called out, demanding a name. Silence. Then, "Please, I can't find the door." That voice didn't belong to Abraham. It didn't belong to anyone they knew. It came again, the next night, and the next. Each time a little different. Sometimes it sounded like Jonas's mother, long buried. Sometimes it was a child's voice, crying. Sometimes it was a voice they couldn't place, but it knew their names. "Jonas, it's so cold out here. Let me in. You know me." But they didn't. Not really. The fire burned low. The food dwindled. Sleep became impossible. Every night the voices returned, circling the cabin, whispering at the cracks, rising just beneath the roar of the wind, always asking. Never angry, just pleading. "I'm so tired. Let me rest by your fire. I remember this place. Please." They held fast. And when the storm passed, and the sky cleared, and the cabin thawed, they opened the door. There were no tracks in the snow, no signs of life, only long, sweeping drifts, untouched and glistening beneath a pale blue sky. Years later, their sons, grown and gray, told the story to anyone who would listen, not with drama or fear, just respect. Because they believed, as many frontier folk did, that the dead sometimes lose their way in a storm, that the blizzard can trick a spirit, just like it tricks a man, and that not every knock means danger, but not every voice deserves to be let in. On the frontier, where whiteouts could last for days, and the horizon vanished into a wall of ice, the wind became a stage for memory, for guilt, for longing. And sometimes it was more than that. Sometimes it was someone else, still out there, still calling, still hoping for the door to open. Montana is a land of vastness. The sky stretches so wide it feels like a second Earth, and the ground raw, craggy, and folded with time, holds stories older than the roads carved through it. Out among the red dust, sagebrush, and weather-bitten stone, there stands a solitary butte, a squat, flat-topped hill that rises just high enough to command the land around it. The locals call it Stillman's Watch. Though no one quite remembers who Stillman was, what they do remember are the figures. Always at dusk, when the sun turns the earth to gold and the rocks cast long, trembling shadows, people report seeing them 2, sometimes 3, dark silhouettes standing atop the butte, motionless, featureless, always facing east. The first known account comes from a cattle herder in 1858. who spotted them while riding fence. He thought they were fellow herders at first, until he realized they hadn't moved in over an hour. He rode closer. The trail twisted through brush, dipped into a dry creek bed, then rose again toward the base of the butte. By the time he reached the top, the figures were gone. He said he felt nothing strange, just a stillness so thick it pressed against his ears, like someone had muted the entire world. He returned the next day. Same time, same place. The figures were back, standing in the exact same position. Over the years, the sightings continued. Miners, soldiers, children gathering firewood. Travelers who swore they'd seen someone watching them from above as they passed the road below. And each time they looked back, expecting the figures to wave or step down, they didn't either. They just stood, silent, distant. One woman, a widow who homesteaded nearby, claimed the figures saved her life. She said she fell ill in early spring and woke one evening to see a man standing on the butte, arm raised, not waving, but pointing. She dragged herself outside and followed the direction of his gesture and found her water barrel had tipped over in the wind, spilling into the earth. Another hour, she said, and she wouldn't have had enough left to survive the night. She returned the next evening to thank him, but the butte was empty. Others have claimed the figures are guardians, old spirits bound to the land, watching the travelers below, waiting for something not yet come. A few say they're omens, that if you see 4 of them, someone in your camp will die before morning. That claim is harder to verify, but one thing is constant in every version of the story. The figures never descend, they never speak, they never cast long shadows, and they never appear in photographs, only as smudges, distortions, static across the frame. To this day, hikers visit Stillman's Watch, some out of curiosity, others in silence, and now and then, just before sunset, someone sees them, tall, still, distant, watching. In the wide, unknowable frontier of the American West, people feared many things: weather, wolves, loneliness. But the scariest thing of all was being seen by something and not being able to understand why. The watchers didn't harm, they didn't chase, they simply reminded settlers of a deeper truth, that not everything in the wilderness was waiting to be found. Some things were already watching. Cities have their own kind of haunting. It's not the cold of the woods or the emptiness of the plains. It's the echo of too many stories piled atop each other, footsteps in crowded stairwells, whispers in alleyways that once held secrets, doors that creak not from disuse, but from the memory of 1,000 hands turning their knobs. And nowhere was this more true than in the theaters of early New York. By the 1830s, the city was already a thundering experiment of brick, smoke, and ambition. Streets bustled with vendors, clanging carriage wheels, and immigrants arriving with wide eyes and worn shoes. But inside the theaters, gaslit and velvet-lined, the world slowed. Curtains rose, music played, and the actors became gods. That's where the story begins, at a theater long since torn down, near what is now Astor Place, where a man named Lionel Gray once played to sold-out houses. He wasn't famous, exactly, but in his time, he was beloved. A leading man with a tragic smile and a voice that carried like thunder. He played Hamlet, Macbeth, Lear. Women cried at his monologues. Men bought extra tickets just to watch him die on stage again. And then one night, he didn't get up. It was the final scene of Julius Caesar. Lionel, playing Brutus, delivered his last soliloquy and fell to the floor, sword in hand, eyes open. The applause was thunderous. The curtain dropped. But behind the velvet, his castmates realized he wasn't breathing. Lionel Gray had died on stage, in front of hundreds. A heart failure, they said. Quick, quiet, poetic in a morbid way. The city mourned. Papers ran obituaries, filled with theatrical flourishes. The theater dimmed its lights, but only for a day. Then the shows continued. That's when the sightings began. Actors rehearsing late into the night reported hearing footsteps crossing the stage. Measured, heavy, but without any shadow. A stagehand claimed he saw Lionel, fully dressed in costume, standing in the wings just before curtain call. When he turned to alert someone, Lionel was gone. Costumes were found draped over chairs. Not scattered, arranged, just the way Lionel liked them. A cigarette left burning in a tray, though no one in the cast smoked. And always, on opening night, a chill in the air. One actress, fresh from Philadelphia, refused to step on stage after seeing a man in the rafters watching her. He was dressed in black, hands folded, expression unreadable. She said he mouthed something as she stared up at him. She couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the line. This was the noblest Roman of them all. She fainted. Eventually, the theater closed, partly due to fire damage, partly due to rumor. But when the building was torn down, workers found something behind the stage wall. A small dressing room, sealed off decades ago. Inside, perfectly preserved, was a costume. Brutus's robes. Sword, a note pinned to the collar. In Lionel's handwriting, "I shall not see another spring." The clothing was donated, the note lost. But those who work in theaters, especially old ones, know better than to mock the tale. Every stage, they say, has its ghost, and every ghost has its cue. And if, just before the lights rise, you feel the room go cold, don't worry. It's just Lionel, waiting for the curtain. In the growing cities of early America, death didn't wait for the country roads or the lonely cabin. It came to opera houses, boarding houses, and corner markets. It slipped between gas lamps and down into cellars, and sometimes it stayed. It was the kind of place you only stayed if you had nowhere else to go. Tucked between two warehouses on a narrow brick street in Philadelphia, the boarding house at Bainbridge Street, number 41, was known for two things: its low rent and its high turnover. The building was old even in the 1850s, its wallpaper peeling like old bark, its floorboards creaking with stories no one wanted to retell. But it was room 13 that people remembered most, not because of anything grand or dramatic. No bloodstains, no history of murder or scandal, just an overwhelming wrongness that clung to the walls like soot. The room was small, a single bed, a washstand, a cracked mirror over the dresser, and a gas lamp that flickered even when the windows were shut tight. New tenants never stayed long. A traveling clerk moved in during a particularly wet spring. He was gone within 3 days, refusing to collect his belongings. When pressed, he simply said, "Romit Schrend." "It's the mirror. I saw someone else in it." A widow named Margaret Turner. Lasted one night. She told the landlady she'd been woken by a cold hand resting on her ankle. The lamp had gone out. The door was still locked from the inside. A sailor, drunk and confident, declared he feared no ghost and took the room for a week. On the second night, he knocked frantically on the landlady's door, pale, shaking, his knuckles scraped. "There's a man in the room, in the mirror. He doesn't blink." She followed him upstairs. The room was empty, except for the mirror. It was an odd one, wider than it should have been. Its frame stained with something darker than varnish. People said their reflections didn't quite match. Not reversed, just off, as if the image on the other side was mimicking them a half-second too late. Eventually, the mirror was removed. They found old writing behind it, etched into the wall with something sharp. "Help me, just once, just that." They patched the wall, repainted, but the fear never left. Rent was lowered, no one bit. The landlady moved. The building changed hands. For a time, it became a tailor's shop. Then it stood vacant. Locals said that even when the building was dark, one light always flickered in the upper window, and if you stood across the street at dusk and looked just right, you'd see someone standing there. Not a shadow, not a trick of the glass, just a man in an old-fashioned coat, face pale, eyes dark, one hand pressed to the inside of the pane. Watching. Urban hauntings often lack the wildness of frontier ghosts, but they have something deeper. Repetition. Cities are stacked with people. Secrets. Regrets. Ghosts don't roam the streets screaming. They linger, in rooms, in mirrors, in the spaces we rush past and never question. Room 13 was never the loudest haunting, but it was one that never quite stopped looking back. Philadelphia, 1793. But the air was thick with something more than summer heat. Horses stumbled in the streets, shop signs faded in the sun, and the smell, sour, metallic and sickly, hung between buildings like an unwanted guest. It was the year the yellow fever came. The city emptied quickly. Those with means fled to the countryside. Those without stayed behind to care for the sick, bury the dead, and survive on prayers and vinegar rags. Churches closed. The ports stopped. Even the newspapers, once filled with talk of revolution, shrank to black-bordered lists of names. And above it all, the bell rang. It hung from the steeple of a chapel just off Pine Street. A small, unassuming place, known more for its soup kitchen than its sermons. But during the fever, it served a different purpose. Each time someone died, the bell rang once. Not for ceremony, not for warning, just to count. Day and night, it tolled, low and hollow, like a heartbeat breaking in half. Some days, it rang 30 times, some 50. One night, a nurse claimed it rang before the man had died, as if the bell already knew. After the epidemic passed, the chapel was boarded up, the bell removed, melted down, some say. Others say it was stolen and tossed into the river to silence its sorrow. But the sound didn't stop. By 1802, people walking near Pine Street after dark reported hearing it again, a single, solemn toll. No pattern, no tower, just the soft thud of metal echoing across cobblestones. Always late at night, always when no one else was around. It's just memory, the doctors said. Wind through ironwork, the skeptics insisted, but the stories spread. A young seamstress claimed she heard it 3 times one week, once each night before her neighbor fell ill. A street sweeper said he heard it as he passed a closed alley and saw no one, just fog, and the sound fading. One man, a doctor who had lost 2 sons in the plague, said the bell rang for him every year on the anniversary of their deaths, at the exact same hour. It doesn't warn, he said, it reminds. To this day, Pine Street has changed. Shops stand where houses once leaned into each other. Trolleys replaced carriages, but some things remain. And if you're out late, walking alone, near the block where the chapel once stood, you might hear it, just once. A sound too deep for the breeze, too slow for church bells. One hollow toll, like the city sighing for the ones it couldn't save. Urban ghosts often have no face. They do not knock. They do not weep. They resonate. They become sound, or scent, or silence. The bell of the yellow fever years is not a ghost in the traditional sense. It is grief, cast in iron, and some echoes, no matter how deeply buried, never stop ringing. Boston is a city built on stone. Its foundations run deep, beneath crooked streets, buried alleyways, and brick chapels older than most nations. It is a city of echoes, not just footsteps on cobblestones, but voices, quiet ones, preserved between mortar and time. At the top of Ashmere Hill stood St. Mark's Chapel, a plain church by daylight, modest, sturdy. Its steeple rose with no flourish. Its bell cracked decades ago, the kind of place people passed without looking. It had no grand organ, no famous stained glass, just a single aisle, worn pews, and a wooden pulpit polished by tired hands. But at night, especially in October, something changed. The first reports came from night watchmen in the 1870s. They walked their routes past the hill and paused, not because of a sound, but a light. The windows of St. Mark's glowed faintly, a soft amber, like candlelight, but no one was supposed to be inside. The chapel had been locked since the winter before, when the congregation had merged with another parish. Then came the music, low at first, a single voice humming a hymn, "Abide with me, fast falls the eventide." The watchmen listened, too afraid to enter. When they returned at sunrise with others, the chapel was empty, cold, undisturbed. It became a pattern. On certain nights, Always near midnight, St. Mark's would awaken. The windows would glow. Music would rise. And sometimes, the sound of preaching could be heard, not loud, not aggressive, but rhythmic, measured, like someone reciting a sermon to a waiting crowd. People began gathering outside, not believers, just the curious. They watched through the old warped windows and said they saw shapes, rows of shadowed heads, facing forward. A man standing at the pulpit. He never moved much, just turned the pages of a large book, though no one could read the words. A few dared to knock. No one answered. One woman claimed the man behind the pulpit looked directly at her and smiled. She fainted on the steps. When she awoke, she said she'd heard her grandmother's voice among the singing, clear as if she'd been standing beside her. Another visitor, a skeptic, brought a camera. He took photos of the glowing windows, but when developed, the prints showed nothing but darkness, except for one. In it, a hand was visible against the inside of the glass, pressed, pale, with a ring on the finger bearing the crest of a long-defunct seminary. Eventually, the city boarded up the doors. The windows were blacked out, but still the light returned. Still, the faint sound of sermon and song drifted into the empty air. Some believe the congregation never left, that in the face of change and time and crumbling wood, they stayed, bound not by ghostly rage or unfinished business, but by devotion, that in a world that forgot them, they continued to gather, quietly, faithfully, eternally. And if you pass by St. Mark's late enough, on the right night, and stand very still, you might hear it too. A hymn, a voice, a word meant for ears long gone, or maybe, just maybe, meant for you. In the growing cities of early America, belief didn't die in the pews. It lingered. Not all spirits haunt with chains and cries. Some whisper from sanctuaries. Some stay not because they're trapped, but because they're welcomed. Ghosts of cities do not always scream. Sometimes they sing. Washington, D.C. was never meant to feel haunted. It was designed, mapped with intention, shaped by geometry and ideals. Streets aligned with compass points, domes, pillars, and arches, all built to inspire order and power. But even within that planned perfection, something strange found a way in, and some say it came wearing boots that never stopped walking. This is the story of President Franklin Pierce, or rather, the man he became after the country forgot him. Pierce served from 1853 to 1857. A man of sorrow before he was ever a man of state. He lost all 3 of his children before taking office. His last son, just 11 years old, was killed in a train accident while Pierce and his wife sat helplessly in the same car. The presidency that followed was gray and distant. He was not loved. He was not remembered fondly. When he left the White House, he was broken. A widower, a recluse. He died quietly in New Hampshire in 1869, and history tried to move on. But Washington couldn't. A few years after his death, a boarding house clerk near Lafayette Square began reporting strange footsteps at night, heavy, even, and slow, like someone pacing in deep thought. The sound echoed through halls empty of guests. Doors that had been shut creaked open. The faint scent of whiskey and ink lingered in rooms long scrubbed clean. It wasn't long before a name surfaced. "It's Pierce," a guest muttered after seeing a tall man in an outdated coat standing at the stairwell landing, half lit by moonlight. He looked like he was waiting for news. He looked sad. Over time, the stories grew. A butler claimed he heard the man reciting names in a whisper. Cabinet members, generals, sons, Hawthorne, he murmured over and over. As in Nathaniel Hawthorne, the author and Pierce's dear friend, whose death had left him in quiet despair. Another account came from a young reporter in the 1880s. He stayed in the same house, researching an article on former presidents, and woke to find papers scattered across his floor. Papers he hadn't brought. On them were scribbled letters in what appeared to be 19th century script. Each one ended with the same line: "I should not have signed it." He returned the next morning to find the room locked from the inside. The boarding house was eventually converted into a law office. Wadabiya. The strange event slowed, but didn't stop. Lights flickered, doors opened. More than once, someone passing the stairwell reported seeing a man seated at the window, hands folded in his lap, staring out toward the Capitol dome, still dressed in a black overcoat, still waiting. Some believe President Pierce never forgave himself, that his sorrow, personal and political, outlived his flesh, that he wanders Washington, not in search of glory or revenge, but simply because he cannot stop retracing the steps of all that went wrong. He was a man lost before death. And some men, they say, don't realize they've died until long after. Ghosts of power are different than ghosts of tragedy. They don't scream or knock or rattle chains. They whisper. They linger in rooms meant for decisions. They sit in silence, surrounded by the weight of what they did and what they failed to do. Franklin Pierce did not haunt Washington with anger. He haunted it with regret. Ghost stories linger. Not because they are loud, but because they are patient. They live in the hush between footsteps, in the quiet of fading candlelight, in the way an empty chair catches your eye just before sleep. They are not always meant to scare. In fact, most of the ones early Americans told were far more mournful than monstrous. They weren't stories about things chasing you. They were stories about things waiting. A woman under a tree, weeping for a child she lost. A man walking the steps of power, unable to undo a signature. A voice in the wind, calling not to harm, but to be heard. These tales were not born in horror. They were born in grief, in longing, in the need to make sense of things that did not fit neatly into prayer or reason. When someone vanished into a forest without a trace, the story filled in the silence. When someone died too young, too brutally, or too unfairly, the tale gave them a second life, one that we could visit, whisper about, and remember. Because remembering is a kind of resurrection, and forgetting, well, that's the true death. Early Americans lived hard lives. Disease, isolation, war, slavery, hunger. These weren't occasional events. They were constants. In that kind of world, ghost stories became a language, a way to process pain, a way to teach, a way to protect the ones still breathing. They reminded people to tread carefully, to speak kindly, to honor the dead, to light the lantern before the sun dipped too low. And maybe, above all else, they offered a soft answer to a terrible question. Are we ever truly alone? Ghost stories say no. They say someone is still walking beside you. Someone is still watching from the butte, still standing at the window, still waiting by the well, not to haunt you, but to be acknowledged, to be remembered, to be named. And in the naming, maybe we ease their burden and our own. So if, tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you hear a creak in the floorboard, a hush at your window, a voice just on the edge of memory, don't be afraid. It's just someone remembering how to whisper,